The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished floors of Kensington Palace as Prince William walked through the familiar corridors. He had returned earlier than expected from his official visit to Birmingham, where he had been opening a new children's hospital wing. The event had concluded faster than planned, giving him a rare opportunity to surprise his family at home. As he approached the private family quarters, William could hear muffled voices coming from Kate's study. He paused, recognizing his wife's voice mixed with others he couldn't immediately identify. There was something in the tone that made him hesitate before announcing his presence. The voices seemed urgent, almost secretive. William quietly moved closer to the partially open door. Through the gap, he could see Kate sitting at her mahogany desk, her usually composed demeanor replaced by visible distress. Her shoulders were tense, and she kept running her fingers through her hair, a gesture he knew she made only when deeply troubled. Seated across from her were two people William didn't recognize immediately. One was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing a simple black dress that spoke of mourning. The other was a middle-aged man in a worn brown coat, clutching a manila envelope in his weathered hands. "Your Royal Highness," the elderly woman was saying, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to burden you with this knowledge, but circumstances have left me no choice. The truth about your family's connection to our village cannot remain hidden any longer." Kate leaned forward, her face pale. "Mrs. Henderson, please tell me everything, no matter how difficult it might be to hear." The man with the envelope cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, what we're about to share could change how the public views the royal family. These documents have been in our possession for decades, passed down through generations of our families who worked on the royal estates." William felt his heart racing as he continued to listen. What documents were they talking about? What connection could there be between Kate's family and some village that he knew nothing about? Mrs. Henderson reached into her handbag and pulled out a faded photograph. "This picture was taken in 1943 during the war. Your grandmother, Mrs. Middleton's mother, was working as a nurse then, but what the family never knew was where she was stationed and what she witnessed." Kate took the photograph with shaking hands. William could see her studying it intently, her face growing paler by the moment. "That's definitely Grandmama," she whispered.
"But I've never seen this picture before."
"Where was this taken?" "Bletchley Park," the man replied solemnly. "But not the famous code-breaking facility everyone knows about. There was a smaller, more secretive operation happening nearby. Your grandmother was one of only 12 nurses who knew about it." Mrs. Henderson continued. "The operation involved treating wounded soldiers who had been exposed to experimental weapons. The work was so classified that everyone involved was sworn to absolute secrecy. They couldn't even tell their own families what they were doing." Kate's hands trembled as she set the photograph down on the desk. "But why are you telling me this now? Why after all these years?" The elderly woman's eyes filled with tears. "Because 3 of those nurses, including your grandmother, witnessed something that was covered up by the government. Something that could have prevented a tragedy that claimed dozens of innocent lives." William gripped the doorframe tighter, his mind racing with questions. What tragedy were they referring to? And why was Kate becoming so emotional about something that happened decades before she was born? The man opened his manila envelope and carefully extracted several yellowed documents. "These are the original medical records from that secret facility. Your grandmother kept copies against direct orders. She couldn't destroy them because she knew that someday the truth would need to come out." Kate reached for the documents but hesitated. "What am I going to find in these papers?" "Evidence that a chemical weapon test went wrong," Mrs. Henderson replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Evidence that the military knew it was dangerous but continued the experiments anyway. And evidence that when local villagers started getting sick and dying, the government blamed it on a gas leak at a nearby factory." The room fell silent except for the sound of Kate's sharp intake of breath. William could see her shoulders beginning to shake as she finally took the documents and began reading them. "The village that was affected," Kate said slowly, looking up from the papers. "It was Little Thornbury, wasn't it?" Mrs. Henderson nodded gravely. 47 people died that winter, including children. The government paid compensation to the families, but they were told it was because of industrial negligence. No one ever knew that their loved ones died because of secret military experiments. Kate's voice broke as she continued reading. "And Grandmama knew the truth all along?" "She wanted to speak out," the man explained. But she had signed the Official Secrets Act. Speaking publicly would have meant prison, and she had young children to think about. She kept the evidence, hoping that someday, when enough time had passed, someone could safely reveal what really happened. William watched as tears began to stream down his wife's face. The weight of this revelation was clearly overwhelming her. She was not just learning about her grandmother's secret past, but about a government cover-up that had denied justice to dozens of families. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward in her chair. "Your Royal Highness, we're not asking you to expose state secrets or embarrass the government, but the families of Little Thornberry deserve to know the truth about why their loved ones died. They deserve proper recognition and acknowledgement of what they suffered." Kate wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself. "How many people know about this?" "Just us," the man replied. "Mrs. Henderson's father was the village doctor who treated the victims. My grandfather was the factory manager who was blamed for the gas leak that never happened. Both of them suspected the truth but could never prove it, until your grandmother's documents came to light. The afternoon light in the room was beginning to fade as Kate struggled with the magnitude of what she was learning. William could see the conflict in her face, the desire to help these families find closure warring against the potential consequences for the royal family and the government. Mrs. Henderson stood up slowly, her age showing in the careful way she moved. "We understand this is a lot to process, Your Royal Highness, but time is running out for the survivors and their families. Most of them are elderly now, and soon there will be no one left who remembers the people who died." Kate stood up from her desk, the weight of the documents in her hands feeling heavier than paper should. She walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens, her mind struggling to process everything she had just learned. The peaceful scene outside seemed to mock the turmoil she was feeling inside. "Mrs. Henderson," she said without turning around, "you mentioned that there were 12 nurses who knew about this operation. What happened to the others?" The elderly woman exchanged a meaningful glance with her companion before answering. "That's part of why we had to come to you now, Your Royal Highness. Of the 12 nurses, only 2 are still alive. Your grandmother passed away with her secret intact, but Nurse Margaret Collins is still living in a care home in Wales." Kate turned back to face them, her eyes red from crying. "She's still alive? After all these years?" "She's 94 years old and her memory isn't what it used to be," the man explained. "But she still has moments of clarity where she talks about the terrible secret from the war. The staff at the care home think she's just having confused memories. But Mrs. Henderson and I know better." Kate sank back into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "So there's a witness who could corroborate these documents?" Mrs. Henderson nodded solemnly. "But she's terrified, Your Royal Highness. Even at her age, even after all these years, she's still afraid of what might happen if she speaks out." The Official Secrets Act cast a long shadow over all their lives. The room fell quiet as Kate studied the documents again. She could see her grandmother's handwriting in the margins, careful notes about symptoms, dosages, and observations that painted a picture of dedicated medical care under impossible circumstances. "There's something else," the man said hesitantly. "Something we haven't told you yet." Kate looked up sharply. "What else could there possibly be?" Mrs. Henderson reached into her handbag again and pulled out a small leather-bound diary. "This belonged to your grandmother. She gave it to my mother just before she died, with instructions that it should only be opened if the truth about Little Thornberry ever came to light." Kate's hands trembled as she took the diary. The leather was soft with age, and she could see her grandmother's name embossed in faded gold lettering on the cover. She opened it carefully to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably her grandmother's, but the words written there made Kate gasp. "I pray that someday my granddaughter will forgive me for the choices I made. The burden of this secret has been too heavy to carry alone, but I could never find the courage to speak while I was alive." Kate's voice caught in her throat as she continued reading aloud. "The men who died in Little Thornberry were not random victims of an accident. They were chosen because they had tried to expose corruption in the local government. Someone wanted them silenced, and the chemical weapons test provided the perfect cover." The silence in the room was deafening. Mrs. Henderson and her companion sat frozen, clearly not having expected this revelation either. "Are you saying," Kate whispered, "that this wasn't just a military experiment gone wrong? That it was deliberately used to target specific people?" Mrs. Henderson's face had gone pale. We never knew that part. We thought it was just a tragic accident during wartime research. Kate continued reading from the diary, her voice growing stronger despite her emotional state. I have kept detailed records of everything I witnessed. The commanding officer, Colonel Matthews, received sealed orders the day before the test. I saw him burning papers afterward and heard him tell his aide that the problem in Little Thornbury has been permanently resolved. The man leaned forward in his chair. Colonel Matthews. That name was never mentioned in any of the official reports about the industrial accident. Kate turned the page and found a carefully drawn map tucked between the diary entries. Grandmama marked the exact locations where the chemical agents were released. Look at this, they form a perfect circle around the homes of 7 specific families. Mrs. Henderson studied the map with growing alarm. My father always said it was strange how the victims were scattered throughout the village, but seemed to be clustered in certain areas. He thought it had to do with wind patterns, but this suggests something far more deliberate. Kate flipped through more pages of the diary, finding detailed descriptions of the victim's symptoms and her grandmother's growing suspicions about the true nature of what was happening. She documented everything, even when she was ordered not to keep any records. Your grandmother was incredibly brave, Mrs. Henderson said softly. She risked everything to preserve this evidence. As Kate continued reading, she found entries that revealed her grandmother's internal struggle. Listen to this. I know I should speak out, but what good would it do? The men are dead. Their families are being cared for by the government compensation, and revealing the truth would only cause more pain. But I cannot live with myself knowing that their deaths were not accidental. The afternoon was growing late, and the light in the study was becoming dim. Kate reached over to turn on her desk lamp, the warm glow illuminating the documents spread before them. There's more, Kate said, her voice barely above a whisper. She writes about meeting with some of the other nurses years later. They all suspected something was wrong, but they were too frightened to compare notes officially. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. What did they discover? Kate found the relevant passage and read carefully. In 1967, Nurse Collins and I met secretly in London. She told me that Colonel Matthews had approached her after the war, offering her money to keep quiet about what she had seen. When she refused, she was transferred to a different hospital, and her military record was altered to remove any reference to her service at the secret facility. The implications of this revelation hung heavy in the air. Not only had innocent people been murdered under the cover of a military experiment, but there had been ongoing efforts to silence the witnesses and cover up the truth. Mrs. Henderson, Kate said, setting the diary down carefully, why didn't your families try to investigate this further over the years? The elderly woman sighed deeply. We tried, Your Royal Highness. In the 1980s, my father petitioned the government for a proper investigation into the deaths in Little Thornbury. He was told that all records related to wartime industrial accidents had been destroyed in a fire. A fire that probably never happened, the man added bitterly, just like the gas leak that killed our relatives. Kate stood up and walked to her bookshelf, pulling out a volume on British military history. She flipped through the pages until she found what she was looking for. Colonel Matthews is mentioned here as being involved in chemical weapons research during World War II, but there's no reference to any operations near Little Thornbury. She continued reading from the book. It says he was commended for his work, developing innovative solutions to wartime security challenges, and that his methods were classified at the highest levels of government. Mrs. Henderson and her companion exchanged worried glances. The evidence was pointing toward a conspiracy that reached much higher than they had originally suspected. Kate closed the book and returned to her desk, her mind racing with the implications of everything she had learned. The afternoon had begun as a normal day, but now she found herself holding evidence of what appeared to be state-sanctioned murder disguised as a military accident. What do you want me to do with this information? She asked quietly. Mrs. Henderson reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. She placed it carefully on Kate's desk, her hands shaking slightly. Before we answer that question, Your Royal Highness, there's something else you need to see. Kate unwrapped the bundle to reveal a collection of black and white photographs, each one carefully labeled with dates and locations. The first image showed a group of men in military uniforms standing outside a building Kate didn't recognize. These were taken by your grandmother, Mrs. Henderson explained. She had a small camera that she kept hidden during her service. She photographed everything she could, knowing that someday the evidence might be needed. Kate picked up the first photograph and studied it closely. In the center of the group was a tall man with distinctive features and a stern expression. "Is this Colonel Matthews?" "Yes, but look at the man standing next to him," the elderly woman said, pointing to a shorter figure partially hidden in shadow. Kate squinted at the image, then gasped. The face was younger but unmistakably familiar. "That's Lord Pemberton, isn't it? The current Minister of Defense's grandfather?" The man who had been silent for much of the conversation finally spoke up. "The Pemberton family has held positions in the military and government for generations. They've been involved in every major defense decision for the past century." Kate felt a chill run down her spine as the implications became clear. This wasn't just a historical cover-up. It potentially involved families who still held power in the current government. She picked up another photograph, this one showing the interior of what appeared to be a laboratory. Men in white coats were working with equipment she didn't recognize, while military personnel observed from a distance. "This is where they developed the chemical agents used in Little Thornbury," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "Your grandmother managed to take this picture during a routine inspection tour." Kate studied the image more closely and noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the corner of the photograph, barely visible, was a sign that read, "Project Cleanup, authorized personnel only." "Project Cleanup," she repeated slowly. "That's not the name of a weapons development program." "That sounds like a disposal operation," the man finished grimly. "We think that's exactly what it was. The chemical weapons testing was just a cover story. The real purpose was to eliminate specific individuals who had become inconvenient to certain powerful people." Kate set the photograph down and reached for her grandmother's diary again. She flipped through the pages until she found an entry dated just a few days before the Little Thornbury incident. "Listen to this," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "Colonel Matthews received a visit today from a man in civilian clothes. They spoke privately for over an hour. Afterward, the colonel seemed agitated and began making urgent phone calls. I overheard him mention the list several times and something about final authorization from London." Mrs. Henderson leaned forward in her chair. "The list?" Kate continued reading. "The next day I saw the colonel reviewing files on 7 individuals. All of them were residents of Little Thornbury. I recognized some of the names because they had been mentioned in news reports about local political disputes." The room fell silent as the full scope of what they were discussing became clear. This wasn't just a wartime accident or even a failed experiment. It was premeditated murder disguised as a military operation. "Mrs. Henderson," Kate said carefully, "how long have you known about the connection to the Pemberton family?" The elderly woman looked uncomfortable. "We only discovered it recently, when we were researching the backgrounds of everyone in those photographs. That's when we realized we couldn't take this information to the current government. Too many of the same families are still in positions of power." Kate picked up another photograph, this one showing a formal ceremony with military officers receiving commendations. Colonel Matthews was prominent in the image, shaking hands with a high-ranking official. "This ceremony took place 6 months after Little Thornbury," she observed. "He was being rewarded for his distinguished service to national security." The man pointed to the background of the photograph. "Look at the banner behind them. It says Special Operations Division, Excellence in Classified Services." They were celebrating the success of the operation. Kate felt sick to her stomach. The ceremony was essentially a celebration of mass murder, disguised as a routine military honors event. She turned back to her grandmother's diary and found an entry that made her hands shake. "I have learned that the 7 men who died in Little Thornbury had been planning to expose corruption in the local government contracts office. They had discovered that millions of pounds in defense spending had been diverted to private accounts controlled by a syndicate of military officers and civilian officials." Mrs. Henderson gasped. "Your grandmother knew about the corruption angle?" Kate nodded, continuing to read. She writes that she overheard Colonel Matthews talking to someone on the telephone about cleaning up the loose ends before the audit. The audit was scheduled to begin the week after the chemical incident. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, creating a picture that was far more sinister than anyone had imagined. The Little Thornbury incident wasn't just murder. It was part of a larger conspiracy to protect a corruption scheme involving massive amounts of government money. Kate found another entry dated several weeks later. The audit of the defense contracts has been postponed indefinitely due to complications arising from the industrial accident in Little Thornbury. The investigation team was told that many of the relevant documents were damaged in the same gas leak that killed the 7 men. Of course they were, the man said bitterly. How convenient. Kate closed the diary and looked at her 2 visitors with a mixture of sadness and determination. You still haven't told me why you brought this to me specifically. Why not take it to a journalist or a member of parliament? Mrs. Henderson and her companion exchanged another meaningful glance before she answered. Because we tried that first, Your Royal Highness. 3 months ago, we approached an investigative journalist at The Guardian with some of this information. What happened? He was very interested initially and promised to look into it thoroughly. 2 weeks later, he called us back and said he had been reassigned to a different story. When we tried to contact him again, we were told he was no longer with the newspaper. Kate felt a chill of fear. They got to him? The man nodded grimly. We think so. Then we tried contacting a member of parliament who sits on the defense committee. He agreed to meet with us, but the day before our appointment, he called to cancel. He said he had been advised that the matter was not suitable for parliamentary inquiry. Kate realized that these people had exhausted their normal channels for seeking justice. They had come to her because they believed the royal family might be the only institution powerful enough to protect them from retaliation, while they sought to expose the truth. So, you're asking me to use my position to help you get justice for these families? We're asking you to help us honor the memory of innocent people who were murdered by their own government, Mrs. Henderson said simply. And we're asking you to help prevent something like this from happening again. Kate looked down at the documents and photographs spread across her desk. The evidence was overwhelming, but she also understood the enormous risks involved in pursuing this matter. The conspiracy involved powerful families who still held positions of influence, and there was clearly a willingness to silence anyone who threatened to expose the truth. But, as she looked at her grandmother's careful handwriting and thought about the families who had lost their loved ones in Little Thornbury, Kate knew she couldn't simply ignore what she had learned. The question was, what could she realistically do to help, and how could she do it safely? William had heard enough. His wife was clearly in distress, and the conversation he had been overhearing suggested she was being drawn into something dangerous. He took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open, stepping into the study with what he hoped appeared to be casual confidence. Kate, I'm back early, he announced, his eyes immediately taking in the scene before him. The elderly woman and her companion looked startled, while Kate quickly moved to place herself between the documents on her desk and William's line of sight. William, I wasn't expecting you so soon, Kate said, her voice slightly higher than normal. She was clearly trying to compose herself, but William could see that she had been crying. These are Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies. They were just discussing some historical research about my grandmother. William extended his hand to each of the visitors, noting how nervous they appeared. Mrs. Henderson's handshake was firm but trembling, and Mr. Davies seemed to be studying William's face intently, as if trying to gauge his reaction to their presence. Historical research? William asked, moving closer to Kate's desk. Despite her attempts to block his view, he could see the edge of old photographs and what appeared to be official documents. That sounds fascinating. What period are you studying? Kate shot a worried glance at her visitors before answering. World War II. Mrs. Henderson's family has some documents related to nursing services during the war, and they thought I might be interested since Grandmama worked as a nurse then. William noticed that Kate was unconsciously wringing her hands, another tell that she was deeply anxious about something. In all their years together, he had never seen her this unsettled by what should have been a simple historical discussion. I see, William said carefully, his eyes meeting Kate's. And this research has been emotionally difficult? Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat softly. Your Royal Highness, perhaps we should continue this conversation at another time. We don't want to intrude on your family time. Nonsense, William said, settling into a chair near Kate's desk. I'm always interested in learning about family history. What exactly did Kate's grandmother do during the war? The question hung in the air as Kate and her visitors exchanged uncertain looks. William could sense that they were debating how much to reveal to him, and their hesitation only increased his concern about what Kate had gotten herself involved in. Mr. Davies finally spoke up. "She was a military nurse, sir. She worked at several different facilities throughout the war, providing medical care to soldiers and civilians affected by various incidents." William's journalist instincts, honed through years of representing the royal family in various capacities, immediately picked up on the careful phrasing. Incidents? That's an interesting way to describe wartime medical emergencies. Kate moved to stand behind her desk, her hand resting protectively on what William could now see was an old diary. "William, perhaps we should discuss this privately later. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies have traveled quite far to share this information, and I think they should be allowed to finish explaining their research." But William was no longer focused on being polite. His wife was clearly distressed, and these strangers had brought something into their home that was causing her emotional pain. As a husband and as someone responsible for protecting his family, he needed to understand what was happening. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, turning his attention to the elderly woman, "you mentioned earlier that this information could change how the public views the royal family. That's a rather dramatic statement for historical research about nursing services." Mrs. Henderson looked surprised that William knew about her earlier comment, and William realized he had revealed that he had been listening to their conversation before entering the room. Kate's face went pale. "William, how long were you standing outside the door?" "Long enough to know that this isn't just about historical research," he replied gently but firmly. "Kate, whatever this is about, we should face it together. These people have clearly brought you information that's upset you greatly, and I need to understand what we're dealing with." The room fell silent as everyone processed William's statement. Kate looked torn between her desire to protect him from whatever burden she was carrying and her need for his support and guidance. Mr. Davies spoke up quietly. "Your Royal Highness, what we've shared with the princess concerns events that occurred over 80 years ago, but the implications could still be sensitive for current government officials and their families." William leaned forward in his chair. "How sensitive?" Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies looked to Kate for guidance. She took a deep breath and made a decision that William could see was difficult for her. "Show him," she said quietly. "Show him everything." Mrs. Henderson hesitated. "Your Royal Highness, are you certain? Once he knows, he'll be in the same position as you, carrying knowledge that could be dangerous." "He's my husband," Kate said simply. "And if this information is as important as you say it is, he has a right to know." William felt a surge of both pride and concern as he watched Kate make this choice. Whatever she had learned, she was willing to share the burden with him, despite the risks involved. Mrs. Henderson reached for the manila envelope and carefully extracted the documents she had shown Kate earlier. "Your Royal Highness, what we're about to share with you involves evidence of government actions during World War II that were covered up and have remained hidden for decades." As Mrs. Henderson began laying out photographs and documents on the desk, William felt his training in crisis management kick in. He needed to assess the situation quickly and determine what kind of threat, if any, this information posed to his family and the institution they represented. The first photograph showed military officers he didn't recognize, but the second image made him pause. "Is that Lord Pemberton's grandfather?" "Yes, sir," Mr. Davies confirmed. "And the documents show his involvement in an operation that resulted in the deaths of civilians who were investigating government corruption." William picked up one of the documents and scanned it quickly. Even in his brief reading, he could see references to chemical weapons testing, unauthorized operations, and deliberate targeting of specific individuals. "Kate," he said slowly, setting the document down, "how long have you been aware of this information?" "Just this afternoon," she replied. "They've been explaining everything to me, showing me Grandmama's diary and the evidence she kept hidden all these years." William looked at his wife's tear-stained face and felt a surge of protective anger, not at her, but at the situation she had been put in. These people had brought her devastating information about her grandmother's past and asked her to make decisions about how to handle evidence of historical crimes. "Mrs. Henderson." "Mr. Davies," he said, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in official capacities. "I need to understand exactly what you're asking of us. Are you seeking our help in exposing this information publicly? Are you looking for justice for the families involved? Or are you simply fulfilling an obligation to share what you've discovered? Mrs. Henderson looked at him with a mixture of respect and sadness. We're asking for help in honoring the memory of innocent people who were murdered by their own government, sir. And we're hoping that someone with your family's influence might be able to ensure that the truth finally comes to light without putting more innocent people at risk. William realized that Kate and he were now facing a decision that could have far-reaching consequences not just for them personally, but for the royal family's relationship with the government and the public. The question was, what were they prepared to risk in pursuit of justice for events that occurred before either of them was born? William spent the next hour carefully examining every document, photograph, and diary entry that Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies had brought. Kate sat beside him, occasionally pointing out details she had noticed earlier, or reading passages from her grandmother's diary that provided context for the evidence. As the full scope of the conspiracy became clear to William, he felt a growing sense of both horror and responsibility. The evidence was compelling and appeared genuine, but he also understood the enormous implications of what they were being asked to do. Mrs. Henderson, he said finally, looking up from a particularly damaging document that detailed the cover-up efforts, have you considered the possibility that bringing this information to light now could put you and your families in danger? The elderly woman nodded gravely. We've thought about little else, Your Royal Highness. But we're old now, and most of the people who were involved in the original cover-up are dead. We feel that this may be our last chance to see justice done, Mr. Davies added. We've also considered what will happen to this information if we don't act. When Mrs. Henderson and I pass away, there will be no one left who knows the full story. The evidence will disappear, and the families of Little Thornbury will never know the truth about their loved ones. William understood their reasoning, but he also had to consider the broader implications. What about the families who are currently in government positions? The children and grandchildren of the people who were involved in this conspiracy. Are they responsible for crimes committed by their ancestors? Kate looked at him with surprise. William, are you suggesting we should protect the Pemberton family and others because their relatives committed murder? I'm not suggesting we protect anyone, William replied carefully. But I am suggesting that we need to think through all the consequences of our actions. If we expose this information, it will destroy the careers and reputations of people who may have had no knowledge of what their families did during the war. Mrs. Henderson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. With respect, Your Royal Highness, the current Lord Pemberton has continued to benefit from his family's wealth and position, even if he doesn't know how they acquired it. And there's something else we haven't told you yet. William felt a chill of apprehension. What else? Mr. Davies opened his envelope once more and pulled out a folder they hadn't shown before. These are more recent documents, evidence that the cover-up has been actively maintained by subsequent generations. Kate leaned forward sharply. What do you mean actively maintained? Mrs. Henderson explained. In 1987, when the government was conducting a review of classified wartime operations, someone made sure that all references to Little Thornbury and Project Cleanup were removed from the official records. The orders for this removal came from the office of the Minister of Defense. Who was the Minister of Defense in 1987? William asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lord Pemberton's father, Mr. Davies confirmed. And in 2003, when a local historian tried to research the industrial accident in Little Thornbury, he was told that all relevant documents had been destroyed in a fire. But we have evidence that no such fire ever occurred. William studied the documents they had just produced, recognizing official letterheads and signatures that appeared authentic. If this evidence was genuine, it suggested that the conspiracy to cover up the Little Thornbury murders had continued for decades, involving multiple generations of the same families. This changes things significantly, he said quietly. If the cover-up has been ongoing, then current officials may indeed have knowledge of what happened. Kate picked up her grandmother's diary again and flipped to a section near the end. There's something here I didn't read earlier. Grandmama wrote this entry in 1989, just 2 years before she died. She read aloud, I have been contacted by someone who claims to represent the families affected by the Little Thornbury incident. They wanted to know if I still had any evidence from my wartime service. I was frightened and told them I had destroyed everything years ago. but I could tell from their questions that they already knew more than they were letting on. William felt the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Someone has been monitoring the potential witnesses all these years, making sure they stayed quiet. Mrs. Henderson nodded. That's what we believe, Your Royal Highness. And there's more evidence to support that theory. She pulled out a small stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. These are correspondence between my father and other family members of the Little Thornberry victims over the years. Starting in the 1970s, several families reported being approached by government officials who offered them additional compensation in exchange for signing new confidentiality agreements. William examined one of the letters, noting the official government letterhead and formal language. They were essentially buying silence from the families. It appears so, Mr. Davies confirmed. And those who refused the additional payments often found themselves facing various difficulties. Lost jobs, problems with government benefits, even issues with their children's university applications. Kate set down her grandmother's diary and looked at William with a mixture of determination and fear. We can't let this continue, can we? These people have been suffering in silence for decades, and their oppressors have been using government resources to keep them quiet. William was quiet for a long moment, weighing the options before them. As members of the royal family, they had certain protections and privileges that could potentially shield them from retaliation, but they also had responsibilities to the crown and to the stability of the government that complicated any decision to expose high-level corruption. Mrs. Henderson, he said finally, what specifically are you asking us to do? Do you want us to take this information to the Prime Minister? To the media? To Parliament? The elderly woman looked at her companion before answering. We were hoping you might know of a way to ensure that the truth comes out without putting more innocent people at risk. You have connections and influence that ordinary citizens don't have. Kate stood up and walked to the window again, her silhouette framed against the darkening sky. There is one option we haven't discussed, she said without turning around. We could arrange for this information to be revealed after our deaths, when we can't be retaliated against. Kate, William said sharply, don't even think about that. We're not going to spend our lives looking over our shoulders because of something that happened before we were born. She turned back to face him, her eyes blazing with emotion. Then what do you suggest? That we just ignore what we've learned? That we let these families continue to suffer while the people responsible go unpunished? William could see that Kate was struggling with the moral weight of the situation, torn between her desire for justice and her fear of the consequences. He also realized that their visitors were watching this exchange carefully, probably trying to gauge whether the royal couple would be willing to help them. There might be another way, he said slowly, an idea beginning to form in his mind. What if we were to approach this through official channels, but in a way that protects everyone involved? Mrs. Henderson looked interested. What do you mean? William began pacing the room as he thought through the possibilities. The current government has been talking about establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate historical injustices. What if we were to suggest that such a commission include wartime incidents that may have been improperly classified or covered up? Kate's eyes lit up with understanding. That way the investigation would be official and protected, but it wouldn't single out any particular incident or family. Exactly, William continued. And if we were to make this suggestion as part of our official duties, perhaps during a speech about historical accountability or veterans' rights, it would be difficult for anyone to argue against it without looking like they're opposed to transparency and justice. Mr. Davies looked skeptical. But wouldn't the same people who covered this up originally be in positions to influence or control any government commission? William nodded. That's a valid concern. But if the commission were structured properly, with independent oversight and public accountability, it would be much harder to suppress evidence or manipulate the findings. Kate returned to her seat, her expression more hopeful than it had been all afternoon. And if the commission were to discover evidence of ongoing cover-ups or witness intimidation, that would be a separate crime that current officials could be prosecuted for. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies exchanged glances, clearly considering this proposal. It would take time, Mrs. Henderson said finally, and there's no guarantee that such a commission would ever be established, or that it would investigate the right incidents. But it's safer than trying to expose this information ourselves, Kate pointed out. and it would provide legal protection for witnesses who come forward. William sat back down and looked at the documents spread across Kate's desk. There's another advantage to this approach. If we're successful in getting a truth commission established, it would create a precedent for investigating other historical injustices. This might not be the only cover-up that needs to be exposed. The room fell quiet as everyone contemplated the proposal. It wasn't the immediate justice that Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies had been hoping for, but it offered the possibility of a safer and more comprehensive resolution. Kate picked up her grandmother's diary one more time. There's something else we need to consider, she said. If we do nothing, and this information eventually comes out through other means, how will it look that we knew about it and chose to remain silent? William realized she was right. If they chose to ignore what they had learned, they would be complicit in the ongoing cover-up. But if they acted too hastily or recklessly, they could put innocent people at risk and potentially damage the institution of the monarchy. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Davies, he said, would you be willing to give us some time to explore this option? And would you be prepared to serve as witnesses if a truth commission were established? Both visitors nodded, though Mrs. Henderson looked concerned. How much time are you thinking, Your Royal Highness? As I mentioned earlier, we're not young, and the remaining witnesses are even older than we are. Kate answered before William could respond. Give us 2 weeks to make some preliminary inquiries. If we can't make progress toward establishing some kind of official investigation within that time frame, we'll consider other options. William felt a mixture of pride and apprehension as he watched Kate make this commitment. She was showing the kind of moral courage that had drawn him to her in the first place, but she was also potentially putting them both in a very dangerous position. As their visitors prepared to leave, Mrs. Henderson turned back to Kate one final time. Your grandmother would be proud of you, Your Royal Highness. She carried this burden alone for so many years, but you don't have to. After Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies had left, William and Kate sat in silence for several minutes, both processing the magnitude of what they had committed to doing. Finally, Kate spoke. Are we making the right choice? William reached for her hand. I don't know, but I know we couldn't live with ourselves if we did nothing. The following morning brought an unexpected and unwelcome visitor to Kensington Palace. William was in his office reviewing his schedule when his private secretary knocked on the door with an urgent expression. Sir, Lord Pemberton is here to see you. He says it's a matter of national security and cannot wait for a scheduled appointment. William felt his blood run cold. Less than 18 hours after learning about Lord Pemberton's family connection to the Little Thornberry cover-up, the current Minister of Defense was standing in his palace demanding an immediate meeting. Did he say what this was regarding? William asked, trying to keep his voice steady. No, sir, but he seemed quite agitated. He's requested to speak with both you and the Princess of Wales together. William's worst fears were confirmed. Somehow Lord Pemberton had learned about yesterday's meeting with Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies. The speed with which he had responded suggested that the royal family was still being monitored, even after all these years. Show him to the blue drawing room, William instructed, and please ask Kate to join us there immediately. As William walked through the palace corridors toward the meeting, his mind raced with possibilities. How had Lord Pemberton learned about their visitors so quickly? Were Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Davies in danger? And what kind of pressure was about to be brought to bear on the royal family? He found Kate already waiting in the blue drawing room, her face pale but composed. She had clearly received the same message and understood the implications of this sudden visit. Has he said anything about why he's here? She asked quietly. Nothing specific, but the timing can't be a coincidence, William replied. We need to be very careful about what we say and what we admit to knowing. Lord Pemberton entered the room with the confident stride of a man accustomed to wielding power. He was impeccably dressed and appeared calm, but William noticed a tension around his eyes that suggested he was under considerable stress. Your Royal Highnesses, Lord Pemberton said with a formal bow. I apologize for the urgent nature of this visit, but I'm afraid we have a situation that requires immediate attention. William gestured for him to take a seat, maintaining the courteous demeanor expected in such formal encounters. Of course, Lord Pemberton. How can we assist you? I understand you received some visitors yesterday, Lord Pemberton said without preamble. Elderly individuals who shared certain historical documents with you. Kate and William exchanged a quick glance. There was no point in denying what had obviously been observed and reported, but they needed to be strategic about how much they revealed. Yes, we did have some visitors, Kate replied carefully. They were interested in sharing some family history related to my grandmother's wartime service. Lord Pemberton's expression remained neutral, but William could see he was choosing his words very carefully. I'm afraid those visitors may not have been entirely truthful with you about their motivations. The documents they showed you are part of an ongoing national security matter. In what way? William asked, keeping his tone politely. Curious rather than confrontational, the individuals who visited you are connected to a group that has been attempting to extort money from various government officials and their families. Lord Pemberton explained smoothly. They've been using forged documents and fabricated stories about wartime incidents to support their claims. William felt a surge of anger at the obvious lie, but he forced himself to remain calm. That's quite concerning. Are you saying the documents they showed us were forgeries? I'm saying that the interpretation they gave you of those documents was deliberately misleading, Lord Pemberton replied. The incidents they described have been thoroughly investigated by the proper authorities, and the official findings are very different from the story you were told. Kate leaned forward slightly. What were the official findings? Lord Pemberton paused as if considering how much to reveal. The Little Thornberry incident was indeed a tragic industrial accident that occurred during wartime. The compensation paid to the families was appropriate and generous. Any suggestion that it was anything other than an accident is simply false. William realized that Lord Pemberton was essentially asking them to choose between the evidence they had seen with their own eyes and the official government position. It was a test of where their loyalties lay. Lord Pemberton, William said carefully, are you asking us to ignore what we were shown yesterday? I'm asking you to understand that you've been targeted by individuals with questionable motives, Lord Pemberton replied. And I'm here to offer the government's assistance in handling this situation appropriately. Kate's voice was steady but cold when she responded. What kind of assistance are you offering? We can arrange for the documents to be properly examined by experts who can verify their authenticity, Lord Pemberton said. We can also provide you with the actual historical records of the incidents in question, so you can see the truth rather than the fabricated version you were presented with. William understood the implied threat. The government was offering to take control of the evidence, effectively removing it from royal custody and ensuring it would never see the light of day. That's very generous, William said diplomatically, but we would need time to consider such an arrangement. Lord Pemberton's facade of friendliness slipped slightly. I'm afraid time is not a luxury we have, Your Royal Highness. The individuals who visited you yesterday are already spreading their false claims to other parties. If this misinformation is allowed to circulate, it could cause serious damage to both the government and the monarchy. Kate sat up straighter in her chair. Are you threatening us, Lord Pemberton? Certainly not, he replied quickly. I'm simply explaining the reality of the situation. The monarchy's relationship with the government is built on mutual trust and cooperation. Actions that undermine that relationship could have unintended consequences for the royal family's position and privileges. The threat was now explicit. If William and Kate chose to pursue the truth about Little Thornberry, they would face retaliation against the institution of the monarchy itself. William felt a moment of doubt as he considered the implications of Lord Pemberton's warning. The royal family's role in British society was indeed dependent on their relationship with the government. Open conflict between the crown and the political establishment could damage both institutions and potentially harm the country. But as he looked at Kate's determined expression, he remembered the elderly woman's tears and the weight of injustice that had been carried for decades by the families of Little Thornberry. Lord Pemberton, William said finally, we appreciate your concern for both the government and the monarchy. However, we need time to fully understand the situation before making any decisions about how to proceed. Lord Pemberton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. How much time? 2 weeks, Kate interjected firmly. We need 2 weeks to review everything we've learned and consider our options. That may be too long, Lord Pemberton warned. The situation is evolving rapidly, and delay could make it more difficult to contain the damage. William stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Nevertheless, that's the time frame we require. We will not be pressured into making hasty decisions about matters of such importance. Lord Pemberton rose as well, his diplomatic mask firmly back in place. Of course, Your Royal Highnesses. I hope you will consider the broader implications of whatever course of action you choose to pursue." After Lord Pemberton left, William and Kate sat in silence for several minutes. The weight of the decision they faced had become even heavier, with the explicit threat of government retaliation. "They're afraid," Kate said finally. "If this was really just about forged documents and extortion attempts, he wouldn't have needed to threaten us." William nodded. "Which means the evidence we saw yesterday is probably genuine, and the cover-up is still active." Kate picked up her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "I'm going to call Mrs. Henderson and make sure she and Mr. Davies are safe." But when she dialed the number, it went straight to a disconnected message. William tried the alternate number they had been given for Mr. Davies with the same result. "Their phones have been disconnected," Kate said, her voice tight with worry. William felt a chill of fear as he realized that their elderly visitors might already have paid a price for bringing their evidence to the royal family. The question now was whether William and Kate were prepared to risk everything to honor the commitment they had made to seek justice for the families of Little Thornbury. As they sat together in the blue drawing room, surrounded by centuries of royal history and tradition, they both understood that the next 2 weeks would determine not just their own future, but the future of the monarchy's relationship with truth and justice. The royal silence that Lord Pemberton was demanding might preserve their position and privileges, but it would also make them complicit in an ongoing cover-up of murder. For William and Kate, the choice was becoming clear, even as the consequences grew more frightening.